Eating the same food every day in old America was not unusual, and it was not considered a problem. It was simply the way life worked. Food was not something people looked forward to, and it was not something they discussed with excitement. Meals were routine, predictable, and repetitive. For most Americans living in the colonial period and the early years of the nation, food existed for one purpose only: to keep the body alive long enough to work another day. Taste was secondary. Variety was rare, and pleasure was mostly irrelevant. The idea of choosing food based on preference would have seemed strange, and perhaps even irresponsible, to many people of that time. Daily life in old America followed a steady rhythm shaped by sunlight, seasons, and survival. People woke early, not because they wanted to, but because daylight was precious and artificial light was expensive. The morning meal, which we now call breakfast, was usually eaten quickly and without ceremony. In most households, breakfast consisted of cornmeal porridge, often referred to as mush or gruel. Corn was easy to grow, cheap to produce, and could be stored for long periods, making it one of the most reliable food sources available. The porridge was made by boiling cornmeal in water, sometimes for a long time, until it thickened into a plain, heavy mixture. Milk was occasionally added if the family owned a cow, but sugar, fruit, or sweeteners were rare luxuries. For many people, breakfast tasted exactly the same every single day. Bread was another common breakfast food, especially in areas where grain was more readily available. This bread was not soft or fluffy like modern bread. It was dense, dark, and often dry, especially if it had been baked several days earlier. Cornbread and rye bread were common, and wheat bread was less accessible to poorer families. Butter was scarce, jam was uncommon, and most people ate their bread plain. Meals were quiet, not because of strict rules, but because eating was considered a practical task rather than a social event. People focused on finishing their food and preparing for the long hours of labor ahead. There were no choices at the table. No one asked what they wanted to eat. The food was already decided by what had been harvested, preserved, or stored. If the harvest had been good, meals were slightly larger. If it had been poor, meals were smaller and more repetitive. Weather, soil, and luck determined the diet more than personal desire. In this world, craving food was pointless because craving did not create supply. People learned early to accept what was available and to be grateful that there was anything to eat at all. The midday meal, often eaten during a short break from work, was usually even less exciting than breakfast. Lunch was rarely freshly prepared. It often consisted of leftovers from the morning or the night before. Cold bread, leftover porridge, or a bowl of beans were common. Beans were a staple food across much of old America. They were inexpensive, filling, and easy to dry and store. Dried beans could last for months, making them especially valuable during winter when fresh food was unavailable. Beans were boiled slowly over the fire, sometimes for hours, and eaten plain or with a small amount of salt if salt was available. Salt played a critical role in early American diets, but it was not always easy to obtain. It was necessary for preserving meat and improving the taste of bland food, but it was also expensive and carefully rationed. Without salt, many meals tasted flat and lifeless, yet people ate them anyway. Hunger mattered more than flavor. Meals were eaten quickly and efficiently, and then work resumed. Eating was not a break from labor. It was merely a pause long enough to refuel. Meat, despite common modern assumptions, was not eaten every day by most early Americans. While hunting and farming did provide access to animals, meat was difficult to preserve without refrigeration. Fresh meat spoiled quickly, especially in warm weather, so most meat was salted, dried, or smoked. Salted pork was one of the most common forms of meat consumed, particularly among poorer families. It was tough, extremely salty, and often soaked in water before cooking to remove some of the salt. Even then, it remained chewy and strong-tasting. Meat was rarely eaten in large portions. Instead, it was used sparingly, added in small pieces to stews or mixed with vegetables to make it last longer. A single piece of meat might be stretched across several meals, providing flavor rather than fullness. For many families, days or even weeks passed without eating meat at all. Vegetables, grains, and legumes formed the foundation of the diet, while meat remained a limited and carefully managed resource. The evening meal, usually called supper, was eaten before darkness fell. Candles and oil lamps were costly, and families preferred to finish eating while there was still natural light. Supper looked similar to breakfast and lunch. Bread, beans, porridge, or a simple stew filled the bowls. The stew, if there was one, contained whatever ingredients were available: beans, corn, root vegetables, and perhaps a small amount of meat. The stew simmered slowly over the fire for hours, and its taste rarely changed from one day to the next. Families gathered at the table, but meals were quiet and brief. Food demanded respect. Every bite mattered, and wasting food was unthinkable. Children in old America grew up eating the same foods day after day, and they did not expect variety. Snacks, as we understand them today, did not exist. Sweets were rare and usually reserved for special occasions such as holidays or religious celebrations. Even then, portions were small. For most children, hunger was a familiar feeling. Physical labor often began at a young age, and the energy required to work frequently exceeded the calories consumed. Being completely full was uncommon, and many people lived in a constant state of mild hunger. Social class did influence diet, but not as dramatically as one might expect. Wealthier families had access to slightly better food and a bit more variety, but even they ate repetitive meals. Imported foods such as sugar, tea, and spices were expensive and used sparingly. Transportation was slow and unreliable, and preservation methods were limited. As a result, even wealthy households relied heavily on bread, meat, and simple vegetables. The poor, however, had almost no variety at all. Their meals were dictated entirely by what they could grow or afford, and repetition was inevitable. Seasonal changes brought small shifts in diet, but they did not eliminate repetition. In summer, fresh vegetables became briefly available, adding some variety to meals. In autumn, harvest time provided a temporary abundance, but these periods were short-lived. Winter diets were dominated by dried, salted, and preserved foods. Fresh produce was rare, and meals became even more monotonous. There were no refrigerators or freezers to extend freshness, and spoiled food posed serious health risks. Eating the same safe foods every day was often the smartest choice. Religion and cultural values also shaped eating habits. Many communities believed that pleasure should be controlled and that indulgence led to moral weakness. Simple meals were seen as virtuous, while excessive enjoyment of food was sometimes viewed as sinful. Eating the same food daily was not only practical, but also morally acceptable. Excitement and variety were not priorities in a world that valued discipline and restraint. Food preparation itself required long hours of labor, especially for women who were primarily responsible for cooking. Corn had to be ground by hand, bread had to be baked in wood-fired ovens, and beans had to be watched carefully as they boiled over open flames. There were no shortcuts. Every meal demanded time and effort, yet the result was almost always the same food that had been eaten the day before. The repetition was exhausting, but it was unavoidable. Special meals did exist, but they were rare. Holidays, weddings, and harvest celebrations offered brief moments of abundance and variety. These occasions stood out precisely because they were so uncommon. After the celebration ended, daily life returned to its familiar routine. Bread, beans, porridge, and stew once again filled the bowls. Food did not serve as comfort in old America. People did not eat to relieve stress or celebrate happiness. Food was neutral, practical, and necessary. Emotional attachment to meals was minimal. Life itself was hard, and expectations were low. People accepted repetition as a natural part of existence. As night settled in, families finished their simple suppers. Bowls were cleaned carefully, leftovers were stored if possible, and the fire was allowed to burn low. There was no anticipation of tomorrow's meals because everyone already knew what they would be. The same food would be eaten again, just as it had been today and yesterday. No one questioned this cycle. It was not seen as boring or cruel. It was simply life. Eating the same food every day in old America was quiet, predictable, and deeply ordinary. It shaped the way people thought about survival, work, and satisfaction. In a world without abundance and choice, repetition became normal. This slow, unchanging relationship with food defined daily life for generations, and it reminds us how different the past was from the present.
A full day in the life of a 1700s American farmer was not dramatic, exciting, or memorable. It was quiet, repetitive, and predictable. Nothing sudden happened, and nothing unexpected was supposed to happen. Life on a farm moved slowly, guided by daylight, weather, and habit. For most farmers, every day looked almost exactly like the day before, and this repetition was not questioned. It was simply the rhythm of survival. The farmer woke before sunrise, not because he wanted to, but because the work demanded it. The house was cold, especially in the early morning, and the fire from the night before had burned down to embers. There was no alarm clock, no rush, and no urgency beyond the need to use daylight wisely. Rising early was a habit learned over years, passed down through generations. Stretching slowly, the farmer prepared for another long day that would likely pass without anything remarkable happening. Breakfast was simple and brief. There was no time or reason for elaborate meals. Cornmeal porridge or leftover bread was eaten quietly, often standing or sitting briefly at a rough wooden table. The taste was familiar and unchanging. There was no thought given to enjoyment. Food was fuel, nothing more. Once breakfast was finished, the farmer stepped outside into the cool morning air, already knowing exactly what tasks needed to be done. The first hours of the day were usually spent tending to animals. Chickens were fed, cows were checked, and fences were inspected for damage. These tasks were performed slowly and methodically. There was no rush, but there was no delay either. Each movement followed habit, shaped by years of repetition. The animals reacted calmly, used to the same routine every morning. Nothing surprising happened, and that was considered a good sign. As the sun rose higher, field work began. Depending on the season, the farmer plowed soil, planted seeds, removed weeds, or harvested crops. The tools were simple and heavy, requiring physical effort with every movement. The work was quiet, except for the sound of metal against earth and the occasional call of distant birds. There was time to think, but thoughts rarely wandered far. The body focused on the task, repeating the same motions again and again. Hours passed slowly. There were no clocks in the field, and time was measured by the position of the sun and the feeling of fatigue. The farmer paused occasionally to rest, leaning on a tool or wiping sweat from his face. These pauses were short, not because of pressure, but because stopping too long felt unnecessary. Work resumed almost automatically, as if the body knew what to do without instruction. Midday arrived quietly. Lunch was eaten in the field or back at the house, depending on distance. The meal was small and familiar: bread, beans, or leftovers from the night before. There was no sense of break or reward. Eating was simply another task completed before returning to work. After a short rest, the farmer went back outside to continue the same labor. The afternoon stretched on slowly. The sun moved across the sky, shadows shifted, and the work continued without variation. The farmer repaired tools, cleared land, or stacked firewood. These tasks required patience rather than skill, strength rather than speed. There was no expectation of finishing early. The work ended only when daylight faded or the body became too tired to continue. By late afternoon, fatigue settled in. Muscles ached, hands were rough, and movements became slower. Still, there was no complaint. This physical tiredness was expected and familiar. It was part of life, not something to be avoided. The farmer completed the remaining tasks carefully, knowing they would return again tomorrow. As evening approached, animals were checked once more and secured for the night. Tools were stored, and the farmer walked back to the house as the light softened. Supper was prepared slowly, often by other family members, using the same ingredients eaten every day. Bread, porridge, or stew filled the bowls. The meal was eaten quietly, with little conversation. There was nothing new to discuss, because nothing new had happened. After supper, the day began to close. The fire was tended briefly, and small chores were completed indoors. There was no entertainment, no reading for pleasure, and no distraction. The farmer sat quietly, resting from the day's labor. Darkness arrived early, and candles were used sparingly. Wasting light felt unnecessary. Sleep came naturally. The farmer went to bed early, not because of exhaustion alone, but because there was nothing else to do. Tomorrow would bring the same routine, the same work, and the same silence. There was no anticipation, no dread, and no excitement. The day had passed exactly as expected. This was a full day in the life of a 1700s American farmer. Nothing extraordinary occurred, no major decisions were made, no dramatic events unfolded. Yet this quiet repetition sustained families, communities, and an entire nation. Life was slow, predictable, and deeply ordinary. In this world, boredom was not recognized as a problem. It was simply life continuing, one uneventful day at a time.
A silent night in an 1800s American village was not unusual or dramatic. Silence was expected, normal, and comforting. When the sun set, life did not continue in another form. It slowed, faded, and eventually stopped. Darkness marked the end of activity, not the beginning of entertainment. Without electric lights, without engines, and without constant noise, night arrived gently and settled over the village like a heavy blanket. As evening approached, the village gradually became quieter. Shops closed early, often before sunset. Doors were shut, shutters were pulled into place, and the last customers disappeared down dirt roads and narrow paths. There were no glowing signs, no street lights, and no reason to remain outside once daylight faded. People finished their work quickly, knowing that darkness made even simple tasks difficult and dangerous. Inside the houses, families prepared for the night. Supper was eaten early, usually while there was still some light left in the sky. Meals were simple and familiar, much like every other meal of the day. Bread, stew, beans, or porridge filled the bowls. Conversation was minimal, not because people disliked talking, but because there was little to say. Everyone had experienced the same kind of day, filled with work and repetition. Silence felt natural. Candles and oil lamps were lit carefully. Light was precious and never wasted. A single candle often served an entire room, casting long shadows on wooden walls and low ceilings. The flickering flame provided just enough light to finish small tasks, such as mending clothes or cleaning dishes. No one lingered unnecessarily. The goal was not comfort, but efficiency. Outside, the village streets were nearly empty. Dirt roads absorbed sound, and footsteps were soft and brief. A horse might pass occasionally, but even that was rare. Most travel stopped after dark. Without lighting and with uneven roads, moving at night was risky.
People preferred the safety of their homes and the familiarity of stillness. The sounds of the village faded quickly. During the day, there had been voices, tools, animals, and movement. At night, only subtle noises remained. The wind moved gently through trees. Wooden structures creaked softly as temperatures dropped. Somewhere in the distance, a dog might bark once and then fall silent again. These sounds did not interrupt the quiet. They blended into it. Most homes in the village were small and simple. Bedrooms were shared, often crowded, and privacy was limited. Beds were made of straw or rough mattresses, and blankets were heavy. People did not stay awake long after supper. There was no reason to. Without light and without entertainment, sleep came easily. The body, tired from labor, welcomed rest. Children were put to bed early. There were no bedtime stories read by lamplight, no toys scattered across floors. Parents expected children to sleep, and children were accustomed to darkness. Fear of the night was uncommon, because night was familiar. It came every day, always the same, always quiet. In wealthier homes, the evening looked only slightly different. There might be an extra candle or a small amount of reading, but even these households respected the limits of night. Books were read slowly, often aloud, and only for a short time. Eyes strained easily in dim light, and wasting candles was discouraged. Eventually, even the wealthy surrendered to darkness. The village itself seemed to sleep. Windows glowed briefly and then went dark one by one. The streets disappeared into shadow. There was no background noise, no hum of electricity, no distant traffic. Silence was complete, broken only by nature. Crickets, insects, and occasional night birds filled the air with soft, rhythmic sounds. Time passed slowly at night, but no one measured it. Clocks were rare, and there was no urgency. People did not stay awake wondering what they were missing. Night was not an opportunity, it was a pause. Life would resume in the morning exactly as it had the day before. Fires were allowed to burn low. Kitchens cooled, and the smell of cooked food faded. Tools rested where they had been placed. Nothing moved, nothing changed. This stillness was not unsettling, it was expected. It meant that the village was safe, that no emergencies demanded attention. Occasionally, a late sound might travel through the darkness, a door closing, a cough, a footstep on a wooden floor. These sounds were brief and unremarkable. They did not signal activity, only necessity. Soon, silence returned. There were no night shifts, no late-night work, and no distractions pulling people away from sleep. The rhythm of life followed the sun closely. Darkness belonged to rest. This pattern had shaped human behavior for generations, and no one questioned it. In winter, nights were even longer and quieter. Snow absorbed sound, making the village feel even more distant and isolated. Fires burned a little longer, but eventually they too faded. Families slept closer together for warmth. The silence felt deeper, heavier, and more complete. Fear of crime at night was minimal in small villages. Everyone knew each other. Strangers were noticeable, and movement after dark was rare. Security came from familiarity and stillness rather than from locks and alarms. As hours passed, the village remained unchanged. No lights appeared, no voices carried through the air. The world seemed paused, waiting patiently for morning. Even animals rested. Chickens slept in their coops. Horses stood quietly in barns. Everything obeyed the same rhythm. Eventually, The faintest signs of morning began to approach. The darkness softened slightly. Birds stirred. But until that moment, the night held its silence firmly. A silent night in an 1800s American village was not lonely or empty. It was full of rest, routine, and acceptance. People did not fight the quiet. They lived within it. Night was not something to fill with noise, but something to pass through peacefully. This was how life slowed, ended, and reset each day. No excitement, no interruption, just darkness, silence, and sleep. And in that stillness, the village waited calmly for another ordinary morning.
Life in early America moved at a pace that feels almost impossible to imagine today. Everything was slow, deliberate, and unchanging. Days did not rush forward, and time did not feel scarce. Instead, life stretched outward, long and repetitive, shaped by nature, labor, and limited resources. People did not expect speed, convenience, or excitement. Slowness was not a problem to be solved. It was simply the natural condition of existence. One of the main reasons life was so slow was the complete dependence on daylight. Without electricity, artificial light was expensive and weak. Candles and oil lamps provided only a small glow and were used carefully. As a result, most activities began at sunrise and ended shortly after sunset. When the sun disappeared, life quieted almost immediately. Darkness forced people to rest, whether they felt ready or not. This daily limitation alone reduced the number of usable hours in a day and created a rhythm that could not be hurried. Travel was another major factor contributing to the slow pace of life. Roads in early America were rough, narrow, and often little more than dirt paths. Travel by foot, horse, or wagon took an enormous amount of time and effort. A journey of a few miles could consume most of a day. Long-distance travel took weeks or even months. Weather often made travel impossible, and there were no guarantees of safety or comfort along the way. Because movement was difficult, people stayed close to home, and life remained small and localized. Communication moved just as slowly as travel. News traveled by word of mouth or handwritten letters. There were no instant messages, no rapid updates, and no urgent alerts. A letter could take weeks to arrive, and by the time it did, the information it carried might already be outdated. This slow flow of information meant that people lived largely in the present moment, focused on their immediate surroundings. The wider world felt distant and abstract. Daily work in early America was physically demanding and time-consuming. Simple tasks required hours of effort. Cooking a meal meant gathering firewood, lighting a fire, and preparing ingredients by hand. Washing clothes involved hauling water, scrubbing fabric, and waiting for it to dry in the open air. Farming required constant attention, with planting, tending, and harvesting done manually. There were no machines to speed up these processes. Every task followed the same slow steps, repeated day after day. Food production alone consumed much of daily life. Crops had to be grown, protected, harvested, and preserved. Animals needed feeding, cleaning, and care. Preservation methods such as salting, drying, and smoking took time and patience. Nothing happened quickly. Meals were the result of hours or days of preparation, and yet they were often simple and repetitive. This constant effort left little time or energy for anything else. Time itself was experienced differently. Clocks were rare, and many people measured time by natural signs rather than precise hours.
The position of the sun, the length of shadows, and the changing seasons were more important than minutes and seconds. Without strict schedules, life flowed steadily rather than urgently. There was no pressure to optimize or rush. Tasks were completed when they were completed, and delays were accepted as normal. Entertainment was limited, which further slowed the experience of life. There were no screens, no recorded music, and no endless sources of distraction. Entertainment came from conversation, storytelling, or simple observation of the world. These activities were slow and required patience. Silence was common and accepted. People were accustomed to long periods of quiet, during which nothing in particular happened. Social life also moved slowly. Communities were small, and people interacted with the same individuals repeatedly. Relationships developed over years, not moments. News and gossip circulated gradually. Events such as weddings, gatherings, or religious services were important precisely because they were rare. The absence of constant stimulation made time feel heavier and longer. Health and medicine contributed to the slow pace as well. Illness was common, and recovery was slow. Medical knowledge was limited, and treatments were basic. People often spent long periods resting or recovering without intervention. Injuries and sickness interrupted life without warning and forced people to slow down even further. There was little that could be done to accelerate healing. Weather played a powerful role in shaping daily life. Rain, snow, and extreme temperatures could stop work entirely. During harsh winters, movement slowed dramatically, and people stayed indoors for long periods. Summer heat reduced energy and productivity. Nature dictated the pace, and humans adjusted rather than resisted. Waiting was a common part of life, waiting for crops to grow, for weather to change, for daylight to return. Education and learning were also slow processes. Books were expensive and scarce. Learning relied heavily on repetition, memorization, and oral instruction. Progress was gradual, and knowledge accumulated slowly. There was no expectation of rapid improvement or instant understanding. Religion and cultural values reinforced patience and acceptance. Many communities believed that hardship and slowness were part of a moral life. Endurance was praised, and restlessness was discouraged. People were taught to accept their circumstances and to find meaning in routine rather than change. This mindset reduced the desire for speed and novelty. Because life was slow, expectations were different. People did not expect constant improvement or progress. Each day resembled the last, and that sameness provided a sense of stability. Change was rare and often unwelcome. When it did occur, it happened gradually over generations rather than years. The absence of urgency shaped emotional life as well. Anxiety about time was uncommon. There were deadlines, but they were tied to seasons rather than hours. Missing an opportunity did not feel catastrophic because opportunities returned slowly and predictably. Life unfolded at its own pace, indifferent to human impatience. At night, slowness reached its peak. Darkness brought activity to a halt. Without light or stimulation, people rested. Sleep came early and lasted long. Night was not filled with productivity or entertainment. It was simply a pause, a quiet waiting period before the cycle began again. This painfully slow pace defined early American life. It influenced how people worked, thought, and understood the world. Slowness was not a flaw in the system. It was the system itself. Life was not designed to be efficient or exciting. It was designed to continue. In modern times, speed is often valued above all else. Efficiency, convenience, and immediacy shape expectations. Compared to this, early American life appears unbearably slow. But for those who lived it, this pace was normal. It allowed for endurance, routine, and survival in a challenging environment. Life in early America was painfully slow because it had to be. Limited technology, dependence on nature, and cultural values all reinforced a steady, unhurried rhythm. Nothing pushed life forward quickly, and nothing demanded constant motion. Days passed quietly, one after another, without urgency or interruption. This slowness shaped generations. It created a world where patience was necessary, repetition was expected, and boredom was not recognized as a problem. Life moved slowly, not because people wanted it to, but because there was no other way. And in that slowness, early American life continued, quietly and persistently, through time.
In the early days of America, people lived in a world without phones, internet, or any of the instant communication tools that we take for granted today. Life moved slowly, and every task demanded patience and attention. The absence of technology meant that people spent their days in ways that were quiet, repetitive, and predictable. There were no notifications, no constant news updates, no digital distractions. Every moment was experienced fully in a rhythm dictated by daylight, seasons, and necessity. Mornings began with the sun. People woke early, often before sunrise, because daylight determined what could be accomplished. The first hours of the day were spent preparing for work. Breakfast was simple: bread, porridge, or leftover food from the previous day. There were no quick breakfasts, no coffee machines, no cereal boxes. Food was prepared manually, often taking hours to cook and ready just in time for the meal. Eating was a slow process, done quietly because conversation was minimal and the day's work demanded focus. After breakfast, the household prepared for labor. In rural areas, this meant tending to animals in fields. Chickens, cows, pigs, and horses needed to be fed, watered, and checked for health. Every task took time. Carrying water from wells, feeding the animals, cleaning their spaces, and making sure fences were secure could consume the morning. Each action was deliberate, performed by hand without shortcuts. This slow pace allowed people to notice details in their surroundings that we rarely observe today. The sound of birds, the movement of clouds, and the wind through trees became part of everyday life. Field work was laborious and required patience. Depending on the season, tasks varied. In spring, land had to be prepared for planting. Soil was plowed manually, seeds were planted by hand, and rows were carefully measured to maximize the yield. In summer, weeds were removed, crops were watered or tended, and pests were dealt with as best as possible. Autumn brought harvest, which required the entire family to work together to gather, store, and preserve food. Winter often meant mending tools, repairing buildings, and planning for the next year. Every task was repetitive, requiring effort without the expectation of immediate reward. There was no machine to make work faster, no timer to measure efficiency, no app to guide the process. Everything was slow and deliberate. Midday brought a brief pause for food. Lunch was often cold or simple: bread, leftover porridge, and occasionally beans or meat. There were no fast foods, no restaurants, no ready-made meals. Eating was functional. People ate to sustain themselves, not for pleasure.
Meals were often eaten outdoors if the weather allowed, or at a simple wooden table inside the house. Conversation existed, but was minimal. People talked quietly about necessary matters, such as weather, crops, and chores. Humor, entertainment, or idle chat were rare because time was valuable and attention was focused on survival. After lunch, work resumed. Afternoons mirrored the morning in pace and repetition. Labor continued in the fields, gardens, or workshops. Every movement was deliberate. Plowing, digging, planting, harvesting, or repairing required concentration and endurance. Even simple tasks took longer than we would imagine today. Without mechanization, every effort demanded strength, time, and skill. Children often joined in the labor from a young age. They learned to contribute slowly and carefully, understanding that efficiency came from practice over time, not from shortcuts or digital tools. In addition to physical work, much of the day was spent maintaining the home. Cooking, cleaning, sewing, and washing took hours. Water had to be fetched from wells, clothes scrubbed by hand, and floors swept with simple brooms. Soap was made at home or purchased in small amounts, and washing often involved large tubs, cold water, and effortful scrubbing. Housework, like field work, was repetitive and never fully complete. The day moved at the pace that the body allowed, and there was no external pressure to move faster. Without phones or internet, communication was slow and deliberate. Letters were written by hand, and the process of delivering a message could take days or weeks. News traveled primarily by word of mouth or printed papers, which were rare in rural areas. People relied on neighbors and local community members for information. Gossip and announcements were spread slowly, often shared during necessary interactions, such as trips to the market or religious gatherings. Waiting for news was normal. There was no instant gratification, no immediate answers, no notifications that demanded attention. Patience was an essential skill. Evening brought the transition from work to rest. Supper was eaten before dark, often consisting of the same simple foods consumed throughout the day: bread, beans, porridge, or a small stew. Meals were quiet. Conversation remained minimal because little had changed during the day. The repetition of tasks and meals reinforced the slow rhythm of life. Candles and oil lamps provided limited light, and people conserved them carefully. The fading daylight naturally guided the end of activity, creating a pattern of work followed by rest. After supper, families engaged in small household tasks. Children might help with chores or prepare tools for the next day. Adults might mend clothes, repair equipment, or plan for upcoming work. Socializing was limited to the household or small gatherings. Storytelling or reading was slow and deliberate, often conducted by candlelight. Books were expensive and scarce, and literacy rates varied. People read slowly, savoring each sentence. Oral storytelling preserved history, tradition, and local knowledge, but it too was slow and carefully paced. Every tale was shared deliberately, often at a level that required attention and patience. At night, in an early American home, was quiet and undisturbed. Without electricity or modern technology, there was no distraction. Sleep came early. People rested fully, waking with the sunrise to repeat the same routines. Darkness was natural and respected. Even the wealthiest households limited activity after sunset, both to conserve resources and because there was little else to do. This created a predictable cycle: work, meals, chores, and rest. Life followed the sun, not the clock, and certainly not digital alerts. The absence of phones and internet meant that entertainment, news, and social engagement occurred in physical spaces only. Towns and villages were small, and people often interacted with the same neighbors repeatedly. Social gatherings were rare and slow, occurring around church services, markets, or seasonal celebrations. Games and music existed, but they were simple, quiet, and communal. Time spent in recreation was limited, deliberate, and valued. Every day was measured by work and necessity, not by notifications or streaming content. Even when traveling, progress was slow. Journeys were made on foot, by horse, or in wagons. Roads were rough. Weather could disrupt movement, and safety was never guaranteed. Traveling from one village to another could take days or weeks. Letters sent along the same routes took just as long to arrive. Waiting for responses and updates was normal. People adapted to these delays with patience, and they rarely experienced frustration because the pace of life was understood and accepted. Because communication, travel, and work were all slow, people developed a deep appreciation for routine. Days were predictable, tasks repeated, seasons dictated work and rest. People did not feel the urgency that modern life imposes. There was no expectation of constant updates, fast delivery, or instant answers. Boredom, if recognized at all, was accepted as part of life. Time was expansive and experienced slowly. At night, the village, town, or farm settled into stillness. Doors were closed, animals were secured, fires were allowed to burn low. The world outside was silent, except for natural sounds, the wind in the trees, the distant call of an owl, the faint movement of snow or rain. These sounds were slow, gentle, and familiar. There was no fear of missing notifications or messages. There was no rush. Life paused naturally. This cycle repeated every day. People worked, ate, communicated, and rested at a slow and steady pace. There were no distractions to accelerate life. Without phones or internet, every action demanded attention and presence. Every task required time and patience. The slow rhythm shaped human thought, emotion, and relationships. People lived fully in each moment because there was no alternative. In this environment, waiting was normal. Waiting for food, waiting for messages, waiting for news, waiting for sunrise or sunset. All of these were accepted and expected. Life was measured in hours.
In early America, eating the same food every day was completely normal. Variety was rare, and people did not think much about taste or pleasure when it came to meals. Food existed primarily to sustain life, nothing more. People ate what they had available, and that often meant repetition. The same types of food appeared day after day, week after week, and season after season. For most families, meals were predictable, quiet, and unimaginative. Yet this sameness was accepted without complaint. Life moved slowly, and food reflected the slow rhythm of existence. Breakfast in early America was simple and uniform. Families typically began the day with cornmeal porridge, boiled in water until thick. Sometimes milk was added if it was available, but sugar, fruit, or flavorings were rare. Bread was another common breakfast food. It was dense, heavy, and often dry, made from corn, rye, or wheat. Butter and jam were luxuries rarely used. Breakfast was eaten quickly and quietly, with little conversation. Eating was functional.
People consumed their meal, then moved on to the labor that would occupy most of their day. Lunch, eaten at midday, rarely differed from breakfast. Leftovers were common, often in the form of cold bread, leftover porridge, or a simple bowl of beans. Beans were a staple food because they were cheap, easy to store, and filling. Dried beans could last for months, and boiling them slowly over a fire made them edible and nutritious. Salt, if available, might be added, but salt was expensive and carefully rationed. Meals were eaten slowly and efficiently, not for enjoyment, but because nourishment was essential for continued work. Meat was infrequent in most households. When it was available, it was typically salted, smoked, or dried to preserve it. Fresh meat was rare because refrigeration did not exist and meat spoiled quickly. Salted pork was common in some areas. It was tough, chewy, and extremely salty. A small amount would be added to a stew or used to flavor vegetables. Meat was not the centerpiece of meals. It was often a minor addition, stretching a small portion across several days. Many families, particularly the poor, might go weeks without eating meat at all. Their diet relied heavily on grains, legumes, and whatever vegetables could be grown locally. Supper, or dinner, came before dark. Candles and oil lamps were expensive, so meals were eaten while there was still daylight. Supper mirrored breakfast and lunch in content and repetition. Bread, porridge, beans, or a simple stew filled the bowls. The stew, if made, contained whatever ingredients were available: vegetables, grains, and occasionally small pieces of meat. The taste rarely varied from day to day. Conversation was minimal because nothing in particular had changed during the day, and the same foods appeared on the table over and over again. Children grew up eating the same foods every day. They rarely experienced snacks, sweets, or treats. Sweets were rare and often reserved for holidays or special occasions. Hunger was a constant companion for many children, especially those engaged in hard physical labor. Meals were functional, sustaining the body for work rather than providing comfort or pleasure. Being completely full was unusual. Most people grew accustomed to mild hunger and repetitive meals. Expectations were low, and food was appreciated for what it was: nourishment. Seasonal changes offered small variations. In summer, fresh vegetables might be available for a brief time. In autumn, harvest provided slightly more variety. Winter, however, relied on dried, salted, and preserved foods. Fresh vegetables were rare, and meals became even more monotonous. There were no refrigerators or modern preservation techniques, so people ate what was safe and would last. Repetition was practical and necessary. Life itself moved slowly, and food mirrored that pace. Work dictated the timing and rhythm of meals. Preparing food was labor-intensive. Corn had to be ground by hand, bread baked in wood-fired ovens, and beans boiled for hours. Cooking took time, energy, and patience. Despite these efforts, the meals were familiar and repetitive. Special foods were rare, and celebrations that brought different meals occurred infrequently. Life revolved around daily labor, and meals were simply part of that routine. Religion and cultural norms influenced eating habits. Many communities valued simplicity, moderation, and restraint. Excess or indulgence in food was often discouraged. Eating the same food every day aligned with these values. It reinforced discipline and endurance. Pleasure in food was not a priority. Sustaining life and fulfilling social expectations mattered more. The repetitive meals of early America reflected broader values of patience, self-control, and acceptance of circumstance. Daily life reinforced the sameness of meals. Labor occupied most of the day, and little energy remained for cooking variety. Family members worked in fields, tended animals, or performed household tasks. By the time meals were prepared, people were ready to eat quickly and quietly. Talking, laughter, or idle discussion was rare. Meals were a brief pause in a long day of work, not an event to savor. Children learned from a young age to accept the monotony as normal. No one expected change. Even in wealthier households, meals were repetitive, though slightly more varied. Sugar, tea, and spices were available, but limited. Meat might appear more frequently, and small luxuries were included. Yet the fundamental repetition remained. Breakfast, lunch, and supper followed similar patterns, and food served practical purposes first. Luxury did not eliminate monotony. It only added a slight variation to an otherwise consistent diet. Life's slow rhythm extended to social eating. Town gatherings, religious events, or celebrations were rare opportunities for different foods. Most of the year, families ate the same meals day after day. When celebrations occurred, special dishes were prepared, but these were exceptions, not the rule. The experience of new or unusual foods was brief and soon forgotten. Life quickly returned to repetition. Food was closely tied to survival. Hunger, effort, and labor defined daily priorities. People ate what could be grown, stored, or purchased. The diet reflected local resources, seasonality, and preservation methods. This practicality dictated repetition. Repetition was not boring, it was necessary. Without variety, families survived. With the same foods, people maintained energy for labor, defended crops, cared for animals, and endured hardship. Life without variety shaped relationships with food. People were not impatient with meals, nor did they seek excitement in what they ate. Flavor was secondary. Satisfaction came from being nourished and ready for work. Meals were predictable, safe, and necessary. Over generations, this shaped expectations. People accepted that meals would always be similar, and they rarely imagined alternatives. Food was constant in a changing world. Preparation of meals reinforced slowness. Cornmeal had to be ground, beans washed and boiled, bread kneaded and baked. Every step took time. Labor-intensive cooking left little opportunity for experimentation. Recipes were passed down slowly, and techniques were simple. Meals followed tradition, mirroring the past rather than introducing novelty. Early Americans rarely strayed from what was known because familiarity ensured survival. At night, meals ended, dishes were cleaned, and food was stored. Families rested, anticipating the same meals the next day. The cycle of eating, working, and resting repeated endlessly. Days were similar. Weeks followed the same pattern. Seasons shifted gradually, providing slight variations, but the basic diet remained constant. Children, adults, and elders all experienced this sameness, and it shaped their understanding of life. Even illness or hardship rarely changed eating patterns significantly. When resources were scarce, portions shrank. When work increased, meals remained simple. Food was measured and rationed to sustain the family, not to satisfy taste. The simplicity of the diet supported endurance. People learned patience with food, just as they learned patience with labor, weather, and life itself. Life in early America was slow, repetitive, and deliberate. Eating the same food every day mirrored the overall rhythm of existence. Labor, rest, and survival shaped every aspect of daily life. Meals were functional, consistent, and predictable. Pleasure in food was secondary. Repetition was not a choice. It was the natural consequence of living in a world without speed, variety, or abundance.
In early America, daily life was quiet, slow, and often repetitive, and this pattern extended naturally to eating habits. Food was not consumed for pleasure, but for survival. Every meal followed predictable patterns, and variety was limited. People ate what was available, what could be grown locally or what could be preserved through simple methods like drying, salting, or smoking. The sameness of meals was not considered unusual. It was simply life as it existed. From breakfast to supper, families consumed the same basic foods, day after day, week after week, and often month after month. Breakfast was simple and functional. Cornmeal porridge, boiled slowly in water, was a common meal for many families. Sometimes milk or cream was added if it was available, but often it was plain. Bread made from corn, rye, or wheat was also common. Breakfast was eaten quickly and quietly because the day's labor awaited. There was no expectation of flavor or variety. People consumed food as fuel, necessary to maintain energy for physical work in the fields, at home, or with animals. Children learned from a young age to eat what was offered without complaint. The monotony of breakfast was considered ordinary and practical. Lunch, or the midday meal, was similar to breakfast in content. Bread, porridge, beans, or leftover food from the previous evening were common. Meals were often eaten at home if labor permitted, or in the fields for those working outdoors. Beans were a staple because they were cheap, filling, and could be stored for months. Salt, if available, was carefully rationed and added sparingly to meals. Eating was functional, not social. Conversations were minimal because the day's events were predictable. Life followed a steady rhythm, and meals mirrored this rhythm in simplicity and repetition. Supper, eaten before dark, reflected the same pattern. The day's labor was complete, and families gathered for the final meal. Bread, porridge, or a small stew made from available vegetables and occasional meat filled the bowls. Meat was infrequent, often salted, smoked, or dried for preservation. Fresh meat was rare and treated as a resource to stretch over multiple meals. Salted pork or small portions of dried beef might flavor a stew or accompany vegetables. These small additions did little to break the monotony of meals. Even in wealthier homes, where spices or sugar might be present, the fundamental repetition of meals remained. Children adapted to these eating habits naturally. There were no snacks, sweets, or treats outside of holidays or special occasions. Hunger was a frequent companion, especially during busy seasons of planting or harvesting. Meals were consumed out of necessity rather than enjoyment. Being full was unusual. Children learned to accept repetition as normal, internalizing the rhythm of survival over variety. Over time, monotony became comforting rather than tedious because it reinforced the predictable structure of daily life. Seasonal changes offered only minor variations in meals. Summer provided a brief period of fresh vegetables, while autumn harvests brought slightly more abundance. Winter, however, was the most monotonous period,
relying almost entirely on preserved foods such as dried beans, salted meats, and stored grains. Without refrigeration, fresh produce was limited, and creativity with food was constrained. Monotony was practical. It allowed families to plan, ration, and survive through long months of labor and scarcity. Preparing food was labor-intensive. Cornmeal had to be ground by hand, bread kneaded and baked in wood-fired ovens, beans washed and boiled over fires for hours. Cooking required attention and time. Even the simplest meals took effort to produce. Despite the labor, meals remained repetitive. Recipes were simple, passed down through generations, and rarely varied. New or exotic foods were uncommon and often unattainable. The daily diet mirrored the slow rhythm of life itself, steady, repetitive, and deliberate. Religious and cultural beliefs reinforced monotony in meals. Communities valued simplicity, self-discipline, and moderation. Overindulgence or unnecessary variety was discouraged. The diet reflected these values, emphasizing what was necessary over what was pleasurable. Repetition in meals supported endurance, patience, and practicality. Life was difficult enough without complicating daily food routines with elaborate preparation or variety. The simplicity of meals aligned with broader social and moral expectations. Meals reinforced the rhythm of daily life. Labor occupied most of the day, leaving little time for preparation or consumption of complex foods. Families ate quickly and efficiently, conserving energy for continued work. Conversation at the table was minimal. Everyone understood that meals were functional pauses in a long, repetitive day. The predictability of eating mirrored the predictability of labor. Children observed and learned the routine, reinforcing the cycle for future generations. Even special occasions offered limited relief from monotony. Holidays, celebrations, or visits from neighbors provided rare opportunities for additional foods, but these moments were brief. Special dishes, sweets, or additional ingredients were temporary deviations from the norm. The pattern quickly returned to simplicity and repetition. Meat was particularly rare in everyday meals. Only during special occasions or in wealthier households did meat appear frequently. For most, salted pork or occasional small pieces of dried beef were the only sources. Even vegetables were limited to what could be grown or stored locally. Corn, beans, cabbage, and root vegetables like turnips and carrots were common. Fruits were rare outside of summer and autumn. Milk or dairy products were not always accessible, and butter or cheese was a luxury. People accepted these limitations as ordinary and necessary for survival. Boredom with meals was rare because expectations were low. People did not anticipate flavor or variety. Instead, they focused on functionality, energy, nourishment, and practicality. The slow pace of life reinforced this acceptance. Days were long, labor-intensive, and predictable. Meals matched this rhythm. Over generations, families adapted to repetitive diets as a natural part of existence. Children grew accustomed to the sameness, integrating it into their understanding of daily life. The preservation of food also enforced monotony. Salted meats, dried beans, and stored grains lasted for months, but their presence limited choice. Fresh ingredients were rarely available in winter. Families rationed what they had carefully. Meals often contained the same items for days in succession. This repetition was practical, ensuring survival rather than comfort. Early Americans learned to appreciate reliability over novelty. Even in wealthier households, where super spices or imported foods might be available, repetition persisted. Breakfast, lunch, and supper followed similar patterns. Foods were prepared slowly and deliberately. Meals were predictable. Luxury items added minor variety, but did not disrupt the rhythm. Life itself was slow, repetitive, and deliberate, and meals reflected these larger patterns. Meals served as markers of the passage of time. Breakfast, lunch, and supper divided the day, guiding labor, rest, and household tasks. Their repetitive nature reinforced the steady rhythm of life. Work followed the sun, and meals punctuated labor. Without modern distractions, mealtimes provided structure rather than entertainment. This predictability shaped social behavior, expectations, and endurance. Food scarcity also enforced repetition. In lean times, families had to rely on what was available. The same grains, beans, or preserved meats were consumed day after day. Fresh produce was rare, and hunting was unpredictable. Families learned to stretch small portions, plan carefully, and accept monotony. This created resilience and patience. Life was slow, deliberate, and repetitive, and meals reflected this reality. Even illness did not change the pattern of meals significantly. People continued eating the same simple foods, perhaps in smaller portions. Labor and survival remained priorities, and the diet remained practical. The monotony of meals provided continuity, reassurance, and stability. Families adapted, understanding that survival mattered more than variety or pleasure. In the evenings, families rested after the final meal of the day. Children went to bed early. Adults completed small household tasks, mending clothes or preparing tools. Candles and lamps were used sparingly. Nighttime provided rest, and food consumption ceased until morning. This cycle of simple, repetitive meals, labor, and rest defined daily life. The sameness of